Hello everyone and welcome to this revision video on life in Elizabethan times. Today we're going to be focusing on the poor in Elizabethan times. We're going to look at the idea of the great chain of being. We're going to look at the reasons for a huge increase in poverty during this time. There's a real sense of a huge division between rich and poor during this time. We're going to look at various attitudes and responses to poverty during this time and about how the attitudes of people slowly changed in Elizabethan times, culminating of course in the Elizabethan Poor Law. We're going to look at the reasons for government action and evaluate the seriousness of the problem during this time. So without further ado, let's go. Okay, Ron, so this shows you the topics that are covered in life in Elizabethan times, and in this revision video we're going to be learning about the poor in Elizabethan times. So the Elizabethan era was dominated by this concept of the great chain of being. There's a real divide between rich and poor during Elizabethan times, as shown in this great chain of being. There's a lot of very, very wealthy people in Elizabethan England, not least Elizabeth herself, but also people like Bess of Hardwicke, people like Lord Burleigh, people like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, for example. Very, very wealthy, and they show that in terms of their fashions of the time, the jewellery that they're able to buy, the clothes that they are wearing, and of course, most significantly, the houses that they build, these so-called prodigy houses, places like Hardwicke Hall, built in the 1590s, places like Montacute House in Somerset by Sir Edward Phelps, Burleigh House near Stamford in Lincolnshire. They all exhibit this huge wealth that the gentry class has during this time. But similarly, there is a lot of problems of poverty during this time. We see a huge increase in begging. And for many people in Elizabethan society, they see this as dangerous. They see this as a threat. A common phrase that's used at the time is the terror of the tramp, a concern that an increase in poverty will lead to an increase in social disorder and perhaps threats to the power and status of those people at the top of the great chain of being. So when we're looking at the various laws that were passed in Elizabethan England to deal with the issue of poverty, with the problem of poverty, it's important that you see it in that context that many people at the top feared this increase in poverty. And of course, there were some people towards the top of the great chain of being, people like Lord Burleigh, that built things like almshouses to try and help out the poorer people. Lord Burleigh's own almshouses in Stamford were opened in 1597. So let's find out a little bit more about how the issue of poverty was dealt with during this time. So during the rule of Elizabeth I, there was a great increase in poverty, and these show you some of the main factors for why poverty is increasing during this time. So firstly, war. There's quite a lot of wars going on. We know at the start of Elizabeth's rule that England was at war with France. So injured and returning soldiers would return back to England. Quite often they would be unable to work. The problems of conflict just generally within Europe, particularly with the Spanish control of the Netherlands and the religious wars that were going on there, interrupted trade, particularly the cloth industry. Antwerp in the Netherlands was the centre of the cloth industry. That was interrupted, so that caused problems of poverty as well. Food supply. One of the key factors which linked in with food supply is the rising population. So the population of England increased from about 3 million in 1551 to 4.2 million in 1601. It's around about an increase of around about 35%. And that's a huge increase. And the problem that they had in Elizabethan times was this rising population was increasingly difficult to feed. So there were problems with food supply, and in particular there was quite a lot of bad luck. So back in Elizabethan times, you could have good harvest some years and then bad harvest other years, just to do with issues around the weather. And there was a real problem with this in the 1590s, and it's really important for you to know that in the 1590s there was a real problem of poverty in Elizabethan England, and this was partly to do with a series of poor harvests, particularly between the years 1594 and 1597. And many poor people simply couldn't afford food. When there was a shortage of food, the prices of food rose, and it was beyond the means of some of the poorest in society. So there was a genuine problem of starvation during Elizabethan times. So obviously the shortage of food supplies caused caused the prices of food to increase, and that led to inflation. So the price of goods generally were increasing during Elizabethan times. So and this was partly to do with things like monopolies, for example. So monopolies is when one person became a sole trader in a particular product. Elizabeth sold monopolies to the wealthy members of Elizabethan society, and this also caused problems with prices being very, very high. Equally, because of the rise in population, it meant there was a lot of competition for jobs. So that meant that wages were driven down low, but prices were high. So we had a real problem of low wages and high prices during this time. And that really typified Elizabethan society. At the same time, landowners were increasing rents, and there was a phenomenon called rent racking, where the price of rent increased. So people were increasingly spending lots of money on the price of rent, both renting land or renting property, for example. And of course, this creates a huge divide in wealth. So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Now, another factor that led to poverty increasing was that in the 1530s, Henry VIII closed down the monasteries, and the monasteries had been used almost as like a type of welfare state in a way, in that the monasteries had been a real support for the poorest in society. So the monasteries had helped people by providing food and shelter during times of hardship, and them being taken away caused poverty, particularly in those communities that had been close to where the monasteries were. The issue of enclosure also led to rural poverty. So enclosure is basically when the farms were enclosed, and basically fences or hedges were put up to kind of stop peasants, for example, grazing their animals on land or growing some of their crops on land. So the enclosure, again, led to an increase in the wealth of the richest who owned land, but also caused poverty for people that didn't have land. And there was also quite a lot of rural poverty, so more of an increase in sheep farming, which required less workers, led to people losing their jobs in rural areas, and meant that wool was in high demand. And we know that the population of London increased massively during this time. So towards the end of Elizabeth's rule, there's about 200,000 people living in London, and many of these people that were made poor would leave their villages and go to cities, but particularly London, in order to try and find work. And then we've already talked a little bit about the collapse of the cloth trade, led to unemployed weavers and spinners. So all of these factors led to a huge increase in poverty. But if I was to say what's the most important reason for the increase in poverty during this time, I would have to say the rise in population. I think that creates the disruption, that creates the low wages, it creates the competition for resources, particularly food, and therefore leads to that low wage but high inflation economy. Which obviously causes a lot of poverty during this time, and ultimately makes the poor poorer and the rich richer. So just a little graphic here, just to kind of show you the difference between arable farming, where you're growing crops, and then the difference between that and sheep farming. And you can see there from those pictures that sheep farming is much less labor intensive. You need far fewer workers to do sheep farming, and that therefore creates unemployment. And that's one of the key reasons for an increase in poverty during Elizabethan times. And there's just a focus on the issue of the monasteries. Monasteries had provided lots of support and help for the poor. It was also, obviously, with the Reformation, it had been a Catholic tradition to give help to the poor, to give alms, ALMS, alms to the poor, where food and resources would be handed out to the poorest in society. However, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that still this continued with the Protestant Reformation. And we know that wealthy Elizabethans such as Robert Dudley and Lord Burleigh themselves did set up almshouses. So there's no real evidence that there is a huge decrease in charitable giving in Elizabethan times, but obviously the monasteries not being there removed an important source of support for the poorest in society. So what were the attitudes to the poor? It's very important that you're aware of this. So at the start of Elizabeth's rule, there's quite a lot of negativity towards people that are poor, and there's very much this idea of the idle poor or sturdy beggar. So a belief that the poor had become poor because they were idle and lazy. And therefore the solution to this was, if they were refusing to work, or if they were lazy or somehow criminal, then the response to this must be harsh punishments. So laws were passed which would punish people for begging. People would be whipped through the streets on market day, so that the punishments were humiliating. In London, basically a kind of prison called the Bridewell was created, and a number of people that were sent to the Bridewell, it's kind of like one of the early workhouses, really, is a good way to think about it, rose from 69 in 1560 to 61 to 555 towards the end of Elizabeth's rule. There's a concern that rebellions are linked to poverty, and there's no doubt that some people that took part in the Northern Rebellion did so not just because of religion, but because of problems of things like food supply and poverty. And then also during this time, there were various books produced. Particularly influential was Thomas Harmon's book in 1566, where he wrote a book which warned about the different types of beggars. So, for example, there was the Abraham man, who was supposed to walk around half naked pretending to be mad, or the Clapperdudgeon, who pretended to be wounded. And there was this sense that beggars were somehow pretending, and that they were criminals, and they were a threat to society, this terror of the tramp at the time. So it was very much an attitude that the poor, therefore, were kind of almost like a criminal underclass that needed to be dealt with severely. However, it's also important to understand that as the Elizabethan era progressed, there was more of a recognition that actually many people became poor through no fault of their own, and these people were known as the deserving poor, or sometimes the impotent poor. And this is a recognition, and we see this increasingly, firstly through the work that's done in local areas like Norwich and Ipswich and York, for example, on trying to tackle poverty. But there's an increasing awareness that some people were poor due to old age or illness, or children were poor because they were orphaned. And the Christian belief in helping the poor, which we've seen way back since the early hospitals were set up in medieval times, right into the work of the monasteries, that actually continues in the era of the Reformation. And particularly Puritans felt that it was a moral duty to support the poor, but also to provide education. And we can see that feature in some of the almshouses that are created by some of the wealthiest in society, particularly toward the end of the Elizabethan era. And the government actually passed laws to make it easier to set up almshouses during this time as well. So one of the things to understand is that the attitude to poor people changes during Elizabethan times and becomes more focused on, yet there is actually a requirement for society to help out the poorest. And we can see the culmination of that in the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, which effectively brings together all of the other measures that brought in during Elizabeth's rule. And of course, that is significant. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So it's very important to understand that the first laws to tackle poverty are actually passed in local areas. So you can see here that rather than the national government taking a response to poverty, individual areas are tasked essentially with dealing with poverty in their own particular areas. And this allows these different cities to come up with their own creative ideas on how to tackle poverty. So, for example, in London, you can see various institutions are created to provide help for the homeless people, the poor people in society. In York, for example, the authorities issue beggar licenses to try and differentiate between what they might see as the idle poor and the deserving poor. In Ipswich, there's a licensing system for beggars from 1569, but also some more creative ideas like a youth training scheme, a type, sort of apprenticeship type scheme to help children gain a trade. And Norwich is very significant. Norwich is the second city in England at this time, separates the poor into the idle poor and what they call the unfortunate poor. And that very much reflects the sort of dual attitude that people had towards poverty at this time, with rich citizens being taxed to actually pay for it. So it's interesting to see there the idle poor were actually given work, and it's almost like a kind of that's kind of like a concept of a workhouse style program, such as knitting and sewing. So some of these creative ideas are then taken into by the national government in due course. So this slide shows you some of the laws that are passed by the Elizabethan government nationally to tackle poverty. Now there's various different ones to think about, and you can look at those. But of real significance is the 1572 Vagabonds Act. Now, this law is really important because it shows that dual approach to poverty. So it shows that there are harsh punishments for people that are seen as being the idle or lazy poor, and they could get a hole drilled through their ear as a mark of shame. They could be imprisoned if they were caught 3 times, and then they could get the death penalty. But at the same time, there's also a recognition that there is a deserving poor, an impotent poor people that need to be helped. So a national poor rate, which is a tax to provide support, and JPs are required, justices of the peace are required to keep a register of the poor and help the poor people to find work. Of also real significance is the 1586 Book of Orders, which had Lord Burleigh's stamp all over it. And basically this Book of Orders is exactly what it suggests. It's a book which contains written orders and instructions for local justices of the peace, which is a common way for how government worked in Elizabethan England. And officials are told how to deal with famines and prepare for harvest failures, such as knowing what stocks of grain were available locally, arranging extra supplies, keeping a supply in case there is a poor harvest. So some of these ideas were extremely useful. And all of these laws culminated in the 1601 Elizabethan Poor Law. Now, what the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 does is basically bring together all the existing measures and ideas into one piece of law, one piece of legislation. And the idea is, and again, you've got that dual approach, the impotent poor should be cared for. They should be helped in almshouses or poorhouses. But those that are regarded as being the able-bodied poor are sent to what is called a house of industry, which is basically like a workhouse, and then poor children should become apprentices. And this is a really significant piece of legislation, and this continues for over 200 years. This law is in place and is the main way that poverty is dealt with in the 17th and the 18th centuries. So that slide just gives you that information about the Elizabethan Poor Law, okay? The idea that everyone has to pay a local tax, and then this real help towards the poor people in society. The Poor Law made each parish appoint an overseer of the poor who would ensure that orphans had apprenticeships and there were almshouses for the old and the ill to live in. And the handouts of money that were given to poor people was known as outdoor relief, and that's very much almost creating in law the idea that it kind of existed where monasteries would give alms to the poor in previous times. So that law is really significant because what it does is it recognises in 1601 that it is the government's responsibility to look after the poor. That support for the poor should be paid for by taxes from the more wealthy people or the people who are working. However, one of the things to be aware of is that nothing was actually done in this act to tackle the root causes of poverty. Nothing is done to bring down food prices. Nothing is done to provide more stable work. Nothing is done to provide more opportunities within farming or help industries. So it doesn't take away the problem of poverty or allow people particularly to help themselves. And there's still a very important role for charities and the wealthier people providing their own alms and almshouses during this time too. Okay, so that was a revision video on the poor in Elizabethan times. We've covered the increase in poverty, the dual attitude and response to poverty in terms of the harsher laws, but also the help towards poorer people, the reasons why the government took action and how serious the problem was, culminating in looking at the significance of the 1601 Elizabethan Poor Law. So I hope you found that useful. Thanks very much for listening. Bye-bye.